Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Ashoka Changemaker Summit 2021. My name is Constanze Frischen. I'm a leadership group member at Ashoka, and I'll be your facilitator for this session. The ACMS is our global convening where we share cutting-edge ideas by and with changemakers across the world. And this year's edition explores the concept of a new togetherness. And this is powered, at least in part, or to a large extent, actually, by new technologies, which is a great segue into the theme of today's conversation, because we'll be discussing technology and democracy, technology and surveillance, and explore a little bit how these go together or not. Before going into that, let me say that, of course, we all love technology, we use technology, we have Ashoka Fellows across the world who use tech to increase access to education, to healthcare, to finance. They use tech to unleash the change-making power of everyone. But there's also a growing group of fellows who are working on issues of governance, on safeguards, on ensuring that tech can work for the good of all. And this is the concept, the focus of today's session. We'll be exploring over the course of the next 45 minutes the topic of preserving democracy in the age of surveillance. You have the opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the chat. The questions will be channeled to me towards the end of our session. And then afterwards, there's also the opportunity for those who join via swap card and who are part of the Ashoka community to enter a closed session right afterwards to debrief and reflect. But now let's go to the most important point. I want to welcome here my panelists with me today. We are having Paul Radu, the co-founder of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, joining us from Romania. The OCCRP is a global network of reporters whose latest Pegasus investigation uncovered the illegal use of spyware against citizens across the world. Then we have Gemma Galdon, based in Spain, at the moment in Greece. She's the founder of Eticas Consulting and Eticas Foundation and developed the concept of algorithmic audit frameworks. And Gemma works with civic organizations, governments, and companies to create markets for digital ethics and trustworthy AI. Hello and welcome, Gemma. And then we have Albert Fox Cahn joining us from New York. He's the co-founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, or STOP, and they work with communities to ensure the law gets updated by legislation and litigation to stop law enforcement from mass surveilling its citizens. Thank you all of you for being here. And I want to jump in and start with you, Paul. We mentioned you, OCCRP. You're also an award-winning journalist. Your work has appeared in the press quite a bit. It's actually an understatement. So the Panama Papers, the Pandora Papers unmasked the hidden offshore accounts and tax evasion strategies of the rich. The Pegasus project uncovered the illegal use of spyware by corrupt regimes to track and harass and persecute adversaries. And I was wondering whether you see a pattern there that connects all these investigations.
Thank you, Constance. Hi, all. Yes, indeed. I mean, when you look at our work over the past, let's say, 15 years, our work as investigative reporters, we've always run into, from bad actors, from organized crime groups, governments, private companies conducting surveillance of journalists and of activists. And then from there, into what we call the criminal services industry. So to us as investigative reporters, the illegal surveillance is part of the criminal services industry where, people who want to expose wrongdoing are targeted, are subjected to such tools. So whenever we would work on a hard story like the Pandora Papers recently, or Pegasus, or before that Panama Papers and the laundromats and so on, we would always have in the back of our mind, the fact that we're becoming more and more of a target, not just for governments who use this type of illegal surveillance, but also for organized crime groups that have access to the same tools, because many of the criminals that we're investigating, have access to a lot of the tooling that's available to governments because of the nature of this business. This business is governed by secrecy. So this goes, to the dark markets where lots of, criminal groups are buying zero-day exploits and other types of malware, to infect our computers, our devices. So it's always like like trying to find a balance between the investigative reporting that we're doing, for the public and trying to preserve the sources and having, always, this mindset that, everything you do is in the open in a way. And this is really, really damaging, so, and this goes into other areas, like, we've had, court cases where some of the people suing us also employed companies, that have this type of capabilities, against us. So there's always a connection between the people serving the criminals and this type of service being offered, in the service of the criminals, or many times in the service of abusive governments and kleptocrats.
And it's interesting what you were saying, because you're using technology as a tool to uncover corruption. You also know that technology is being used as a tool to uncover what you're doing, to monitor you, and generally it's being used for good and for bad purposes. So I wonder, do you have a feel for, or let me ask it this way: has your view of technology changed over the years, and do you think more is an answer?
I think, as reporters working on organized crime and high-level corruption, our view of technology definitely evolved in the sense that we know more of it right now, and we use more of it for sure. At the same time, we did know when we started, OCCRP, this platform for reporters to investigate crime and corruption, that criminals are always early adopters of technology. So, and there's a big gap between what they have at their disposal and what we do have at our disposal. But what's actually, what works to our advantage is that we are a little bit more creative sometimes because we work across borders, or we like to think that we are a bit more creative, compared to the criminals. Although, criminals have like brilliant ideas when it comes to, putting together their schemes and all that. So I think technology ultimately works to our advantage. So it tilts a little bit the scale towards us, but what we're doing is still limited. So I think if we'll have like a project that's bigger than Pandora Papers and Panama and all of this together, that's when we'll encounter the real enemy. That's when, we'll actually be met with a lot of force, with a lot of resistance when it comes to technology. So I think we still have to push towards that point and be as ready as possible there.
Well, it seemed quite big already. Let's unpack a little bit when you say criminals. It sounds so anonymous. Who are criminals for you and your work?
Well, to us, we're always focused on high-level corruption. So these would be politicians in many countries all over the world, east, west, south, north, everywhere. And then transnational or organized crime groups that work on the basis of the infrastructure put together by these politicians. Or, so what we're seeing is, and it might sound like a huge conspiracy, but we're seeing, organized crime building avenues for their crimes, from illicit financial flows to illicit shipments to all sorts of crimes that benefit from global infrastructure for 3 or 4 decades already, like large scale. While us as investigative reporters, we just started, like, let's say 15 years ago, doing our work together. So I think when I'm saying criminals, I'm speaking mostly about this intersection between organized crime and high-level corrupt politics.
And when you say we, your group of reporters, can you say a little more about how you manage to connect and coordinate groups of journalists from across the world targeted at one issue?
So OCCRP is a platform for investigative reporters, and we work with other platforms, ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We work with Forbidden Stories, for instance, who led the Pegasus project, and so on. So the idea is that we connect networks between them, and then it's not just investigative reporters. For instance, at OCCRP, we formed an alliance with Transparency International, where, in short, we build the evidence, and we build stories on the evidence, and we put out data, and Transparency International, based on that evidence, builds activism and advocacy. So this is really about a cross-sectoral kind of alliance, that goes into, scientists. We're working, hand in hand with social scientists. It's still limited work that we're doing, and we're trying to kind of increase these systems from our side, and to give more tools to others to become investigative reporters, because really, our goal as OCCRP is to dissolve investigative reporting into the society, because everybody can be an investigator ultimately.
Perfect. Hold this thought. We come back to it. I want to move on over right now to Albert. It's a good segue, because Albert, what Paul was saying is probably very familiar to you in your context of monitoring surveillance, primarily in New York. You work at the intersection of technology, privacy, civil rights. And what I didn't know before I met you is that New York City is one of the worst offenders of surveillance-wise in the world. There are more than 15,000 surveillance cameras in the city center alone that the police has access to. It basically means you're never alone when you visit New York, when you live in New York. So tell us a little bit more about how this works, and then also the question, is that all legal, what the police do?
Yeah, and it's fascinating hearing Paul's discussion. I'm a huge fan of his work because I think, it's right to look at the ways that those who would break the law can abuse technology and the way that technology can hold them accountable. But what we see is the ways that, state actors, the NYPD, other government agencies can use technology to augment and expand what we know is a racist and abusive policing system that we
Let me
can
just
see.
quickly explain for our non-American viewers. NYPD is the New York Police Department. Go on.
Yes, and thank you for that. We are far too familiar with acronyms in surveillance land, and I think, like all New Yorkers, I think of my city as the center of the known universe, and at times presume familiarity. But yes, with the NYPD, with our local police department, we've seen the growth of a paramilitary organization on the scale of a small country with a budget commensurate with it, and really stunning capabilities to invade nearly any aspect of our life. And the question you asked about whether it's legal, the stunning reality is all too often yes, and not because we've passed laws that enable it, not because our civilian officials have ratified it, but because our legal structures enable the police to act in the absence of a denial, in the absence of a law saying that you cannot buy this technology, that you cannot use this new form of surveillance. At the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, we're trying to invert that paradigm. We're trying to reassert civilian control over the technology that's used to monitor our lives, and to really reaffirm the principle that in a democratic society, we cannot have the police fundamentally redefining the contours of the social contract and the questions of what autonomy we're allowed to navigate our city unwatched, whether that's through facial recognition, predictive policing, social media monitoring, or even, these dystopian four-legged drones that you may have seen on the news parading through New York City apartment buildings.
So let's zoom in on what you were saying, or let's rather start. So there is, by law, by the American Constitution, citizens have the right to protection from, against unwarranted invasion of privacy by the state, right? And at the same time, you're saying that a lot of what law enforcement right now is doing is not yet outlawed. So there is an interesting change in the economics of surveillance that I heard you speak about, and I was wondering whether you could draw this out a little, the difference, how surveillance used to work in the analog world and how it is now.
Yeah, and none of the surveillance abuses we're seeing now are completely novel. Rather, they're an extension of the practices we saw historically. But it used to be that it took thousands and thousands of dollars per day through rotating surveillance teams, dozens of officers, all of this equipment just to track one person, just to track them across the city. But now you can track millions of people for pennies using things like geofence warrants, new types of court orders, using data that you can purchase outright from the apps on our phone. And what this economy of scale has done is it's removed the form of economic particularity. This is the idea that economic pressures force the police to target in their surveillance on those cases where they had the most acute need. But now, in the absence of that economic pressure, when it's cheap to track all of us, you then have this realization that the constitutional rules that we had assumed were protecting us all along, well, they actually weren't all that helpful, because it was oftentimes the cost of the technology, not the the oversight by the courts that limited what tools the police turned to. And so what we see is that under the Fourth Amendment, it says that we have the right to be protected in our papers and homes and effects, but it ignores the way that, our information is now being handed over to these companies like Google and Apple and our cell phone providers, that using these platforms is the prerequisite to engaging in modern life. This is something that could never have been predicted in the late 18th century, and yet because of this, we have a legal framework where the police may not be able to come into my home and take my physical papers without a warrant. They may not be able to do that without going to court. All too often, they can take the most intimate electronic information that I have from these companies without any judicial oversight. And that is particularly true for when they're tracking our physical location across the city.
So digital technology makes scaling of surveillance possible at basically zero costs, and that is a problem. So quickly, Albert, tell us, you are organizing communities across New York to update the law and to outlaw certain practices. Tell us about what is your latest win that gives you hope.
So it is very easy to see the dystopian state of affairs and think that, the technology will turn us into some sort of science fiction movie where everything is tracked. But, we see this growing awareness that things have gone so bad that we need to take action. And the ways that we're doing that here in New York is by passing the POST Act, the Public Oversight of Surveillance Technology Act, the first surveillance bill that was enacted in New York in a generation, the first since 9/11. That actually required the NYPD to tell us how they were tracking us, to disclose the tools that are being used. We've also successfully sued under open records laws to obtain access to hidden contracts with surveillance vendors. We've released more than $250 million in previously hidden surveillance contracts that the NYPD entered into. We also have class action litigation where we're starting to update those constitutional rights to account for the ways that, we see police abusing their powers when they have access to these modern technologies. And we're also taking some of the vendors that serve the NYPD and other local police departments to court. So, I think it's, really reached a crisis point in how far we've let this surveillance state progress. But sometimes it takes that moment of crisis to galvanize the sort of community pushback that's needed for change to take place. And what's been so incredible is seeing these coalitions, more than 100 organizations, many grassroots, hyper-local organizers coming together to say, this is not how we want our city police. This is not how we want our communities tracked.
Thank you, Albert. And interesting. So we heard from Paul about the necessity to provide transparency through journalism and investigation. You, Albert, mentioning the power of community action, the power of legislative action to ensure governance. I want to now turn to Gemma, founder of Eticas Foundation, Eticas Consulting. And Gemma, you are... So I want to hear from you. So humans love technologies. We think that machines and computers are more objective than we are. And you've researched that quite a lot. And so tell us more about why that is the case.
Well, that's the case because the technology industry has benefited from decades of humans thinking about what the future may look like, and they play into our hopes for progress and societal advancement. And because technology has been framed as this magical thing, we all can feel technology with whatever values we have. So we all think that technology works for us. And deep down, we all hope that just by pressing a button, we can solve all our problems. And that's what the technology industry sells oftentimes. So in a way, our fascination with technology has been very much fed into by the PR campaigns and strategies of the technology industry. And so we found ourselves in the last generation, at least, completely unprotected from the ills and wrongs of technology, because our faith in its ultimate good capabilities has been pumped so much.
We tend to believe that data is objective, and that therefore algorithms are objective and almost removed from, human subjectivity. Now, tell us why that is not necessarily the case, and why indeed such a perception can be questionable.
Well, it's just incredible that we've been led to believe that with more data, we will make better decisions. I mean, there's so many things that we know are happening. We have a good diagnosis on why things happen, and we still haven't been able to solve it. So we know why people starve in large parts of the world. We know that the problem exists. We have the right diagnosis. We have the data, and yet we don't solve it. So solving problems is not about having the data to analyze those problems. It's also about having the political will to act on them. And so for some reason, we've been told that just by gathering the data, we will be that will automatically lead to better decisions, and that is not happening. But also what we are seeing in technology is how technology is incorporating all the social dynamics of the real world. And so in a world that is full of inequalities, our technology captures those inequalities. And so you go, for instance, to the labor place, where technology is playing more and more of a role in hiring and firing, in performance assessment. And what you see is that every single technology in the labor place always reinforces the power of the employer, and not the so clear in the labor environment happens everywhere. And so what we see is that our technologies are currently just reinforcing the inequalities in our world.
And how can that be? For instance, even there's a lawsuit being brought forward against Apple and Goldman Sachs, for instance, that their credit card is biased against women, giving them a lower credit score than men. So presumably, this is not being done intentionally, right? This is not being done on purpose. So how come this happens?
Well, I guess the difference maybe between where we work on and what Paul and Albert work on is that they work with agents that have bad intentions. We work with agents that don't know better or are incompetent. And so we kind of see we're optimistic because we see room for improvement, because it's not like these people want to discriminate women when providing banking services, or discriminate Black Americans in health provision. Those are not intended consequences of the technology. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes in our experience, these are just a result of bad technology being implemented in many, many places. So our goal is to improve the quality of the technology around us, but also improve the oversight and the accountability of the technological solutions that are being incorporated into our everyday lives. What we're finding is that because we are surrounded by low quality technology, by really bad technology, that technology is speaking up on the inequalities and the discriminations of the real world. And so in the banking sector, because women are underrepresented in databases, because up until 20 years ago, in some places even today, the financial representative of the family is the man. And so in the data set, men are overrepresented. And if you build a lazy algorithm that just picks up the pattern of the past and is instructed to reproduce that pattern, then the pattern is, I give more and better credit to men. That can be fixed, but unfortunately, no one's fixing this.
Yeah. And this is exactly where you come in with a framework of algorithmic auditing, which is designed particularly in uncovering these biases and fixing them, as you say. And how is that being perceived? Is it easy for you to persuade companies to do algorithmic audits?
it's not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy because we're going against some of the established mantras around technology, and that AI is cheap and easy to incorporate and it's better than humans. Basically, when we come in, what we're saying is that's not the case. Good AI is not cheap. Incorporating good AI means a digital transformation process. Humans need to be involved. It is a socio-technical interaction all the time. And the only way we can fix algorithms is by understanding the society that they're impacting on. So we need different profiles. We can't just keep on coding the world using engineers that don't understand the world that they are trying to code. And so we're going against some very established mantras around technology, and that makes our work difficult. However, there are pioneers out there, people that have been trusting us to help us learn how to open the black box of AI, how to open an algorithm and fix it. So when we're hired by a bank and we see that the bank is discriminating women, we can fix that through specific solutions. We can incorporate synthetic data, we can incorporate rules into the algorithm. So protecting people in technical processes is not difficult. It's just that we have a technology market that is so lazy that it cannot get itself to incorporate the profiles that would help them understand how to protect people in those technical environments. So going back to your question, is it easy? No, it's not easy. But I am convinced that 5 years from now, only 5 years from now, we will look back at 2021 and we will be amazed that there was a time when we were incorporating algorithms into health, into education and schools, into the police, into social services, that we're incorporating these AI systems into these high-risk scenarios without auditing them.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And I now want to come to all three of you on the screen so we can start a little bit of a group discussion. I was just seeing notes from Albert and Paul in the chat, both of you saying, oh, we have a lot of incompetence too, and even crime and corruption is riddled with incompetence. So I wanted to give you a chance to quickly elaborate on these comments. Paul, what were you thinking? Oh.
Well, I mean, when it comes to high-level corruption, a lot of it is backed by incompetence. And, there's smart criminals, there's dumb criminals, there's, very, devious politicians, and there's also dumb politicians. And even those dumb politicians can be utterly corrupt. And sometimes, they flow on this path of corruption without even knowing. So that happens quite often. I just wanted to add, if I may, two things. One, I think what Albert mentioned, with the law enforcement using all these surveillance techniques, massive surveillance, this all ultimately spills into the criminal world too. We've seen examples of this, many times in at least two ways. One is all these private military companies and private security companies that serve organized crime groups, and these are usually former law enforcement. And then, of course, code is lots of times vulnerable, vaults and places like those are not quite secure, and they kind of spill into the public domain, especially in the criminal public domain, dark markets and all. Also, to Gemma's point about biased code and code that doesn't really serve people. What we've seen with the Pegasus project, especially when speaking to experts, is that a lot of the code, a lot of the algorithms behind, some of our comms, some of our daily kind of tools are built like in times where surveillance and mass surveillance was not necessarily a concern. So what happened in the meantime is that people built up on this code, and there's people who don't even understand what they're building up on. They don't understand the base of all of that. This is all it's spaghetti code, legacy code, where in order to actually build fair code, you need to overhaul the whole system. But that means a lot of expense for these companies, for these corporations. I mean, even if you take iMessage, and the code that's behind iMessage, it's just crazy what's actually in there. So I think there needs to be like a zero moment when we start thinking about this and we really overhaul all this, because if we'll build keep on building on this rotten kind of basis foundations, we won't ever get to a place that's fair, that's good.
I see Gemma and Albert both.
That's a really good point. Yes, if I can add to that, the things that we keep on building really bad systems. So it's not that we are inheriting bad systems, that is the case, but we're also building worse systems on top of really bad systems. So we are worsening the problem when talking about AI and all these capabilities and these amazing things that will happen because of these new data solutions, when we're actually just making the problem worse. Because really what we see, even in high risk scenarios, like the algorithms that are deciding who gets hired and fired or who gets medical care at the emergency room are really, really, really bad. We are using really simple algorithms to solve complex problems. Everyone, again, as I said before, everyone hopes that with just the press of a button, you could solve a difficult problem, but that will not happen. Technology cannot help us address complex issues. Complex issues will require complex technologies. And unfortunately, the market right now is not providing us with complex technologies. They just want to make a quick buck, and they sell really lazy and simple tech that has fundamental human rights implications.
And if I could just add, I think with some of this technology, there's no fixing it. There's no way to fix facial recognition, because if you have facial recognition that no longer has racial bias, that now is able to be much more accurate, you've created something that's even more dangerous for democracy. You've created something that makes it even easier for police to target people for political activity, for their religious beliefs. And so I think with some of these technologies, it's really crucial to identify the drivers of bias, the way Gemma was describing, to have a comprehensive audit framework. But I think that especially when it comes to the government use of these AI systems, particularly in the criminal justice space, that a lot of these, use cases for the technology are simply irredeemable. And one of the things that when Gemma was talking about incompetence, one of the things that I see with AI in state and local government, which is a huge driver of incompetence, is just the magical thinking that a lot of this technology enables. That that somehow we, like you were saying, that there's this simple piece of code that can solve these really intractable issues. And one of the clearest examples of that was the technology we saw rolled out during COVID-19, whether exposure notification apps, some of the vaccine credentials, these new systems where they said, well, we can solve issues around social trust in the vaccine by having this new piece of technology. And at least in the United States, it's been a disaster. When I tried to do a security audit of New York State's vaccine app, it took me 11 minutes to forge something. And the city's one was even worse. So I really do worry that we are able to deny the need for really hard systemic change when we can just slap a new app on something.
A really good point, going back to this. Sorry, Gemma, do you want to? I was just going to say, is going back to your earlier point, that humans sort of love technology, and when we hear about tech, it's somehow delegating responsibility and being more objective. There's a small delay to you, so I'm not sure whether you wanted to comment, but let's move to, I'm starting to get questions from the audience here, and there is...
I just wanted to point, sorry.
Go ahead.
Apologies, there's a delay, and that's awful. I just wanted to say on what Albert was saying, the importance of framing the problems in a correct way. Because if we only focus on discrimination when talking about facial recognition, then yes, we can fix discrimination. Through algorithmic auditing, we can fix discrimination. But that is not the only problem we have with facial recognition. Facial recognition has issues with the impact on the environment, how much energy it consumes to train the facial recognition algorithms. It also has security issues. If your face is your passport, if your passport gets stolen, how do you get your face back? So there's crucial issues in terms of the security of using your body as a proxy for identity. And there's also issues of power. Who can use the facial recognition on whom? I think all those things need to also be put on the table. And I think that if we only talk about discrimination when we talk about technology, we're doing a disservice to the cause of protecting people in those systems. And I'll shut up now. Apologies.
A really important point, Gemma. It depends on the framing and on the definition of what is the problem here. And only then we can judge whether something is an adequate measure. I'm getting questions from members of our audience, and I'm starting to put them out here so you can see who would like to answer. There is one question: is there a good example of a country where there's actually political will to use data to solve issues and to demonstrate good governance? And then there is another question around, Paul, you said criminals are often the first adopters of new technologies. So question to all of you, what are you thinking about cryptocurrencies and what safeguards we need to make sure decentralized finance works for all? Who wants to go with, is there a country or a place that is a positive example? Is there any?
So I'm happy to take a stab on this. I think that it's hard to generalize for a country because one of the themes we've seen with these technologies is it's not about the specific tool that's being used. It's not even about the country where it's being used, but it's the state agency that is employing them. So the risk profile with a Department of Transportation using automated license plate readers, it's very different from when a police department uses that same technology to track where everyone drives around a city. And so when we've looked at, for example, congestion pricing models and ways of trying to make people bear the cost of driving into city centers. Stockholm, Sweden had a very effective model for how they were regulating the use of that particular technology, allowing it to actually enforce the tolling system while preventing police from commandeering it as a law enforcement tool. But that's just one specific system, and I don't think there's going to be a country that overall we can point to as a panacea of privacy protection and equity on all of these different tools.
Thank you, Albert. Paul, do you want to take the crypto question? Do you have any experience with that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, we recently hired a cybercrime editor that does exactly this. We're trying to follow the money across cryptocurrencies, and it's proven to be a hard task because there's a lot of transparency when you talk about public ledgers and blockchain, but in fact it's harder to track down this type of transactions than it is to track down fiat currency, for instance. So criminals have been at it for many years. And there's, again, when you talk about journalism and activism, there's again a gap because you have the criminals that are early adopters of cryptocurrencies. You have the law enforcement that has some capacity to investigate, but the citizens themselves are not given proper tooling to be able to even be in that market proper. You see countries right now like El Salvador, embracing Bitcoin as legal tender. And others, but organized crime groups, we're seeing this for about 10 years now, have used cryptocurrencies to launder money. Kleptocrats have used cryptocurrencies to amass more wealth. So it's really a question of when do we come together to understand a bit better what's going on and to have the proper tools to follow the money, because ultimately, if you look at the surveillance that's used by the criminals, all this is, used because they want to amass more money and more power, So this is where we come in as investigative reporters. We investigate this intersection of money and power. We investigate the outcome of all this tooling that they put together, including the surveillance industry and so on. So I think this is where we have to act to kind of look at the supply chain, the criminal supply chain, if you want, where surveillance is part of the game. It's actually a very important piece of the game, and And it's the same, I think, in the case of the law enforcement, because there's so much abuse there, and not just in New York. We're actually seeing a lot of abuse when it comes to law enforcement using surveillance techniques in Eastern Europe, where I'm from. And it's even less oversight than what you have in New York, a lot less.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Here's another interesting question. I guess it goes to Gemma. What would be the incentivization for companies to rebuild code from scratch? Basing on our earlier comments that a lot of times the code is just bad.
To make better decisions. Like basically all the hopes that we are putting on technology are being kind of killed by bad technology. And so we have all these hopes that by investing in AI, we'll reduce costs, we'll make better decisions. And what's happening, it's the other way around. So to go back to the example of the bank, if a bank is excluding women from credits, that's a really bad business decision, because some women can be really good clients. And so basically with bad data and bad systems, you are making really bad decisions. And so if you want to get the best of technology, if you want to really use the technological progress we've made in the last decades, in the last years, you need to get it right. And so if you keep relying on low quality systems, basically you're going to get it wrong. So I think that's the incentive. Unfortunately, it's being really hard to put that argument forward. But I think that as we see our systems collapse around us, as we see more and more news about discrimination, but also inefficiency, I think there'll be more awareness of the need to address those issues. And let me just take some time to go back to the cryptocurrency question, because I think it's really important, especially in the context of a panel on democratization. I think that from the point of view of social justice and redistribution, supporting any currency that does not allow you to pay taxes is basically stealing from our social systems. So I think that we need to frame this innovation also in terms of what is its impact on our democratic societies. And I think basically they're undermining the very basis of what democracy is, which is a space where we take care of one another and where we build collective systems that protect the most vulnerable. If currency allows itself to be outside of that system of redistribution, I think we're pretty much killing our political systems.
Touching on a governance and regulation here. Albert, I see you've raised your hand, so we are also nearing the end of our session. So Albert, you have the last comment here, the last word.
Oh, I feel like it's hard to go beyond what Gemma was just saying, because she's completely right. With cryptocurrency, just like a lot of these technologies, they were sold to us as a way to invert the power structure of our societies to level the playing field, but they just replicate the existing dynamics we already had and make the powerful even more powerful. And with cryptocurrency, it seems quite clear that with a product with huge externalities, with huge harms to societies and, our tax base and everything, and also where the only apparent use case that people have found is ransomware, there's a lot to be very skeptical of going forward.
Thank you. That was a powerful reminder of, the fundamental truth that tech is a tool that is being used by humans. And as we live in a society that is unequal, and as we have bad and good intention, tech just amplifies the direction in which we take it. So thank you for your comments and contributions, Albert, Gemma, Paul. It was fascinating. We are at the end of our 45 minutes. I know that for those who have joined via swap card and who are part of the Ashoka community, there is now the opportunity to hop into smaller discussions and reflect and bond. And to all the others, thank you so much for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe. Thank you.